If you have a question that you'd like to ask one of the debaters, or a question that you would like to ask for both of them, go ahead and come on and kind of queue up here, and I'll invite you forward to the microphone. And then when you do ask the question, please let us know, are you asking for Mr. Anderson, for Dr. Corvino, for both, so that they know how they should respond. But anyway, so go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank both of you guys for coming out and talking on your viewpoints and everything. It was very insightful. But this question is primarily for the both of you. So this baker, this man that refused to make this cake for this gay couple, in Christianity, homosexuality is viewed as a sin. Now, on your opinions and in your insight, why is it that you guys think that this man, this baker in particular, said, based off of this sin that you two are committing, I'm not going to make the cake, versus other people that may walk in and have be a liar or be tattoos or be cheating on their wives or husbands or whatever? Why is it that you think this homosexuality thing is so big? Like, why is this sin so much focused on in this sense?
Thank you for that question. The first thing I would say is just to acknowledge that while many Christians consider same-sex relationships a sin, that is a controversial issue, and you are no doubt aware of the fact that there is much discussion and debate and dialogue within denominations and across denominations about how we interpret the scriptures and tradition on this question. And that takes us well far afield of our discussion tonight, but it's at least something worth acknowledging. Secondly, I think you're right that bakers are often, and other providers are often inconsistent about this. One of the things I talk about in the book is Kim Davis. When Kim Davis was asked, well, what would you say? Kim Davis was the Kentucky clerk who would not issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. And she was asked by a reporter, well, what would you say to people who divorce and remarry? Because it seems like the scriptures condemn that as well. And she said, that's between them and God. It's like, well, that seems like quite a double standard. That's between them and God, the divorce thing. But this thing, no, I'm going to enforce God's law in the clerk's office. So it struck me as inconsistent. But the main thing I want to say in response is to point out that one of the reasons that we see these cases coming up more in the wedding context is that otherwise our sexual orientation is often not visible. Right? If I go in to buy a birthday cake, you're not going to necessarily know that I'm gay. I mean, maybe if it's like a Lady Gaga-themed birthday cake, but generally, rainbow sprinkles across. But generally, there was actually a case, this is funny, there was a case in Toledo, Ohio, where a person ordered a birthday cake for her lesbian partner. The baker went on the customer's Facebook page, realized that she was in a lesbian relationship and the birthday cake was actually for the lesbian partner, sends her a text and cancels the order, says, sorry, I don't do cakes for these sorts of things. And first of all, who does that? Go on the customer's Facebook page. But secondly, the reasoning was, now that I know that this is being given in the context of a same-sex relationship, I don't want to participate in this thing that I think is immoral and sinful, this same-sex affection. Even though it's not the sexual aspect of it, it's still something that she didn't believe in. And so a number of the arguments, I think, can carry over. So I think part of direct answer to your question, part of the reason we see bakers doing it in the wedding cases is because that's when our sexual orientation is manifest, is visible.
So, I just think the premise of the question doesn't apply to Jack Phillips. Jack Phillips has turned down exactly as many same-sex wedding cakes as he has turned down divorce cakes, and it's one of each. So both times when he thought someone was doing something that undermined his understanding of marriage, he said, I can't do that. But the majority of the requests that he has turned down have had nothing to do with sexuality at all. They've been Halloween cakes. They've been actually some bachelor party cakes that he won't do if they have lewd images. So if you have a bachelor party cake and you want a naked woman on top, he won't be doing those cakes either. He won't do the anti-American cakes. So he's been trying to live his entire life in conformity with his principles. And the vast majority of the cakes that he's had to say no to have nothing to do with homosexuality one way or the other, have nothing to do with sexuality. The second thing I want to add, and this is more of a response to what John just said, is that I think it's actually vitally important for us as a community to be able to distinguish someone like Jack Phillips and someone like Barronelle Stutzman. Barronelle is a a florist who was selling flowers to a particular gay couple for a decade. She was their florist. She knew they were gay. She would do happy birthday flowers, get well soon flowers. She couldn't do the same-sex wedding flowers. And so the Attorney General of the state of Washington sued her in both her professional and her personal capacity. I think it's important that we can distinguish between them and people like the Westboro Baptist Church. People like the funeral homeowner that John mentioned says, we don't serve your kind here. Because if we simply say anyone who believes marriage unites husband and wife and then tries to live out that belief in their public life is the functional equivalent of an anti-gay bigot, it's actually going to, I think, foster a backlash, which is why you've seen this year, the Human Rights Campaign just yesterday released their report showing that acceptance of gays and lesbians has actually gone down in the past year. It's the first year in recent history in which the trend line reversed. It's one reason why I think in an hour, Donald Trump will be giving the State of the Union address. I think the people who voted for Trump, it was a backlash from what's been called the smug style of liberal politics, in which people look down on evangelicals and they look down on white working class people. That's not to excuse it. I didn't vote for Trump. It is to say, though, that we have to be careful in how we combat true evils, that we don't also lump in well-intentioned, good-natured people as if they're also the evil that we're trying to combat.
I want to underscore an important point of agreement. I didn't vote for Trump either.
Good evening. Thank you both for coming. So I want to contextualize the question a little bit. It's more of a principle question because I think a lot of the discussions about the nature of justice and specific questions of the case going before the Supreme Court concerning Masterpiece Cake Shop relies on a lot of principles. And I think that a discussion of principles is probably a prior question to discussing justice writ large. And you know, as Jefferson said, not every difference of opinion is a difference of principle. So I just kind of want to gauge where each of you stand on principle. And I want to address my own bias a little bit so it contextualizes a little bit more. But I'm a libertarian, so I kind of think that government is probably abusive in a lot of cases. And as I'm sure you're aware, Dr. Corb, you know that at some point, or at one point in American history, the administration of the death penalty was okay. In Virginia state history because of anti-sodomy laws and the use of government to oppress individuals within the United States, and that was reinstated through Jim Crow laws. And obviously there's the concerns that Dr. Anderson talks about. And I think individual liberty is probably a pretty good check on a lot of individual discriminatory abuses, for instance, the liberalization of the automobile industry, precipitating the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement, and to some degree eroding the institution of slavery. And so my question deals with, at what point is the use of government force to seize individuals' property and to imprison individuals, at what point is that justified? And when is it not justified? Is there a guiding principle that for each of you determines when that is not okay or when it is okay?
You want to go first?
Sure. So I actually think John and I see this more eye to eye than we do with you, partly because neither of us is a libertarian, right? I mean, so the dissertation I wrote was titled Neither Liberal Nor Libertarian, a natural law approach to property rights and social justice, so a natural law approach to social justice and property rights. And so I think both libertarians on the far right and liberals on the far left get this wrong and that the truth is somewhere in between. So you say, what justifies it? And it's going to be a very broad response, justice and the common good. And then and I think John and I agree with that, so I see John nodding his head. The disagreement is going, all right, well, what does justice and the common good require in particular tough cases? So for example, John and I agree, laws banning discrimination on the basis of race were justified in 1964 when Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. Because leaving it just to the free market wasn't going to work. It wasn't working. African Americans were locked out of certain markets. They were locked out of certain opportunities. They couldn't attend certain schools. They couldn't work in certain professions. They couldn't flourish to the greatest extent of their capabilities because of unjust private discrimination. And so public authority said, even on private property, you can't discriminate on the basis of race. John and I agree. We disagree, though, on how to apply those same principles in the case of something like the baker, the florist, the photographer, the Catholic adoption agency, a Christian university, things like that. We agree, though, in the case of a hospital. If John was to get hit by a bus going home tonight and an emergency room said, oh, we won't treat you, you're gay, that's unjust, that shouldn't be allowed. And even though, let's say it's a private hospital, they shouldn't be able to do it, right? So we have some agreement on LGBT discrimination. We have disagreement on other cases, and then we have agreement on the race stuff. You should speak for yourself, though, so I'm sorry I spoke for you.
You're doing a great job. We didn't vote for Trump. We believe in the common good. I mean, we're doing great. The only thing I would add is, when Ryan was talking about racial discrimination, talked about people being locked out of markets, and I do think that that's different from the current state of affairs for LGBT people generally. But I also think that one of the important reasons we have laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation is the point that I made earlier about sexual orientation not being visible, much like, for example, religion is often not visible. And the idea is that when we go into the public square, when we enter public places of business, we should not have to hide or closet those aspects of our identity in order to have basic services, whether it's to buy the same cake as our neighbors or to have, funeral services like our neighbors do. And it's unfortunate that in some places people feel that they need to do this and in fact do need to do it in order to get services, even though, again, the situation is very different from the race case.
Little tiny quick follow-up.
Sure.
If the idea is that the common good is the ultimate thing that society needs to defend and justice should reflect that, then at what point is that an absolute statement that the common good always trumps the individual interest? Or is there a guiding principle that divides a situation where the common good might not be justified in trumping individual interest?
I think a rich enough you wrote a dissertation on this, so I'm going to let you talk more, but I think a rich enough understanding of the common good is going to be one that has a rather robust notion of the individual and individual rights.
Yep.
He's shaking his head. There's good. Yeah.
We agree.
Yeah.
This question is mostly for the religious liberty side, and the question
We're
is...
all in favor of religious liberty. That's Ryan, I'm John.
And the question is mainly about how the U.S. Constitution strictly talks about freedom of religion and how each person has the right to express their religion, as long as it's just, of course. But through this, we can see that the United States is mainly a mostly Christian country, and of course that's been changing over time. But that's led to more discrimination among other religions that went against Christianity. So where does a line draw when it comes to freedom of religion or just freedom of religion for only Christians?
Great question. Especially in the era of Trump, that's a great question. So since we didn't get a chance earlier to say this, where John and I also again agree is that religious liberty is for A through Z, right? Anglican through Zoroastrian, and right in the middle of that alphabet is Muslim. And so Muslims get the same religious liberty rights that Christians receive, and that Mormons should receive. And in our history, we haven't always respected the religious liberty rights of either Mormons or Muslims. We've been much better about the Anglicans. We haven't been as good about the Zoroastrians. And part of that is just human nature is that you're more sympathetic to people who you have more in common with, right? We form in-groups and out-groups, and we sympathize with fellow co-believers, and we ostracize other people. And so it's important that we apply the same exact principles, whether the plaintiff is Jewish or Catholic or evangelical or Lutheran or Muslim or Mormon, which is why I tried running through that litany at one point in this. And so at the Supreme Court, at the federal level, there's something known as RFRA. It's an acronym, RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And it says the federal government can only burden the sincere exercise of religious faith for a compelling state interest being pursued in the least restrictive way possible. And that same standard should apply whether it's a Christian a religious person or a Muslim or a Jew or whatever the faith is. And where this has been particularly important has been in zoning cases, where you might have an insular community that is denying the zoning permit for Muslims to build a mosque. And so thankfully, many of the religious liberty groups that I've been active with have sued on behalf of Muslims and have filed amicus briefs on behalf of Muslims, sometimes at great cost. So I'm not Southern Baptist, but the Southern Baptist Convention filed an amicus brief supporting the right of a group of Muslims to build a mosque. And then they received all of this hate mail and blowback from fellow Southern Baptists saying religious liberty is just for other Christians. So I think we got to insist that it's for all people, because the foundation of this has something to do with human dignity. So it gets back to the common good here. We want each human being to be free to seek out the truth about God as they understand God, and then to live out that truth as they understand it, congruent with the rights of others, right? And that's why there's that balancing test, compelling state interest being pursued in the least restrictive way possible. Sometimes the state will have to infringe on sincere religious beliefs, but it should be the same standard.
I would add, one of the things we do in the book is we have a jointly written introduction, and one of the things we talk about in that introduction is what we call the Puritan Mistake. It's actually a phrase that comes from Doug Laycock. So, you've all heard about, the Pilgrims and later the Puritans who come to this country, in pursuit of religious liberty. And that's part of the story, because, what happens is they come in pursuit of liberty only to then turn around and engage in their own forms of religious oppression with the idea that religious liberty means the liberty to do things my way. And another place where we agree is that both sides can have this tendency, or the right wing, left wing can have this tendency of sort of my way or the highway kind of, and we certainly see that in some of the religious liberty debates that happen with people outside of the mainstream Christian tradition. But do watch out for those Zoroastrians; they are trouble.
This is for both of you, but I just want to start out by saying thanks for coming. I'm always looking to hear more perceptions, details on situations where maybe oftentimes in the public square we just see headlines or what people want, what the news wants you to believe situations. So the more details, the better, and you both provided that, and I appreciate that. One of the things that I think tends to get left out is you're talking about the Masterpiece Bakery. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I can understand why the gay couple may have been upset, because it's my impression that they drove 3 hours to get there. So when you hear stories like that, unless I got it confused with another story, it's hard not to believe that there's some sort of targeting of Christian organizations or beliefs. I've also heard a story of a Muslim person who won a lawsuit because he didn't want to deliver beer. And that seems crazy to me because that was his job. But it seems like the only people it's okay to discriminate against these days is Christians. And when you hear things like with North Carolina passing the bathroom law, and you have Bruce Springsteen canceling concerts, NBA threatening to cancel the All-Star game, it seems where it wasn't okay for the Masterpiece Cake Bakery to discriminate, but it seems okay for these other people to deny services based on their beliefs. So I'm wondering how those two get distinguished when it seems to be a double standard in the society where it's okay for one group to do it but not okay for Christians to do it without believing that it's some sort of, as you said, targeting of the wicked.
So there's a lot in your question. No, it's a rich question, which I appreciate. One of the things I want to do is to acknowledge that, there are certainly cases where people are going to shops for the purpose of having these test cases so that there can be some kind of complaint or a lawsuit. Certainly the case of William Jack going to a Zukar bakery asking for the homosexuality as a detestable sin cake, he did that precisely for making a point, and I don't doubt that, that has happened in other cases as well. As far as we know, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case was not one of those cases. This is a couple who were legitimately surprised when they walked into the shop, were flipping through the catalog, and were told that they could not buy a cake. And I do think that it's different when we're talking about somebody like Bruce Springsteen saying he's not going to do a concert. I mean, it's one thing if there's a breach of contract there, but Bruce Springsteen is not a shop open to the public. I mean, it's a different kind of thing. And when I say different kind of thing, by the way, I actually, and I say this in the book, and I've said this elsewhere, I think that the photography cases are much more difficult than the cake shop cases. Both intuitively, because the photographer has to be on site and doesn't just sort of provide something that you then go do something with later on, but also because the photographer is producing something that is in each case a unique thing, so the design-based, use-based distinction that I set up, it doesn't apply neatly over there. But I don't think we should conclude that this is just a case of, Christians are being targeted all over the country, but other groups are not. And, you said the thing about the Muslims and alcohol. I mean, there's some interesting cases. We didn't talk about this in the book, but there are interesting cases having to do with taxi drivers. And Muslims, not only do not consume alcohol, traditional Muslims, they do not wish to, carry it, have it in their possession. And for a while, I think it was in New York City, but in certain jurisdictions, they developed sort of systems where if a customer was like visibly carrying alcohol with them, the dispatcher would just send you to a cab that was not by a Muslim driver. And of course, it's away in your bag, nobody knows, it's different. And that worked out well, but then complaints were, you maybe know more about these cases than I do. These cases come up across a wide variety of religious traditions, and they're different kinds of cases.
So I agree with more or less everything John just said. What I would just want to highlight is my understanding of the Masterpiece case is that the couple lived in Lakewood, Colorado, which is where the Masterpiece cake shop was. So they didn't drive 3 hours just to kind of set him up for this. But the reason they went to him was that their wedding planner recommended him. And she recommended him not to set him up, but because he's really, really good at doing these creative, custom-made masterpiece cakes. Right? I mean, that's his niche. Which is why, people don't pay thousands of dollars for the wedding salad. Right? There's no such thing as the wedding salad. But people are willing. I was married within the past year, and we paid much more for the wedding cake than the flour and the sugar and the frosting was worth. Right? What we were paying for was the work of art, right? And it's a centerpiece, it's symbolic, we cut into it, I shoved it in her face, she pushed me up against the wall. There's a whole ceremony. There are pictures but there's a whole kind of ceremony around the cake. And the reason that brides and grooms, and for that matter, brides and grooms care about the wedding cake is it's symbolic. That's why the wedding planner suggested that they go see him. And that's why I think you can better sympathize with Jack Phillips as to why his objection was to the wedding cake in a way that it wasn't to cupcakes or brownies or cookies or other things that might be used at the wedding. So that was one thought. The second is this, what John mentioned about the taxi dispatcher. So my understanding is that it was at an airport, and Muslim taxi drivers would be in a different lane, and so the taxi dispatcher at the front of the taxi stand could put passengers in which lane, depending on whether or not they were carrying alcohol or they had alcohol in their breath, as a way of being able to accommodate the religious beliefs of Muslims. And the passengers never knew, right? So you land at the airport, you're in line, you get to the front of the line, you either go to lane A or lane B, you don't know, you don't care, and Muslim taxi drivers get to keep their jobs. It's a win-win. North Carolina tried doing the same, actually succeeded. They did the same thing for clerks. The way that North Carolina avoided the Kim Davis situation was 2 months before Obergefell, they passed a law saying every legally eligible couple will receive a marriage license without delay, but we will accommodate as many clerks as we can who have objections to issuing marriage licenses for whatever reason. So if you work at a county clerk's office in the state of North Carolina, you can just notify your superior that you have an objection to doing marriage licenses, and you get reassigned. You'll start doing gun licenses, gun permits. You'll do deeds and wills and estate. There are all sorts of things that go on at county clerk's offices, and someone else will be handing the marriage license desk. So as a result, no couple is inconvenienced, and as many clerks as possible that can be accommodated and can keep their jobs. It's a win-win situation. And yet, some people objected to that. I don't know if Bruce Springsteen did or not. I think his objection was to the bathroom bill. But I think wherever possible, we should try to allow people to live their lives in accordance to their beliefs, if we can accommodate them. Sometimes we can't.
Would you say that about Keith Bardwell, if he would just refer people to another justice of the peace?
Yes, if we didn't know, and so like North Carolina does this. So they don't ask Keith Bardwell what his objection is. They just say, oh, if you have an objection, whether it's to interfaith weddings, interracial weddings, same-sex weddings, you just won't be doing marriage licenses. We'll have you in some other part of the office. Where I wouldn't do this, though, is if it actually was known that his objection was based on race. And this highlights a distinction on how we look at various religious liberty and free speech laws. One question is, would a protection undermine the very purpose of the law? So we say that a protection for pro-life doctors doesn't undermine the ban on discrimination on the basis of sex. Whereas a protection for racists would undermine a ban on discrimination on the basis of race. So again, I think it does require like one more level of nuance to say, does protecting religious liberty or free speech in this context help undermine or support a good outcome? And then we actually have to look at the actual case and the specifics and all the rest.
Yeah, I know. I agree with that principle. We disagree, of course, about some of the specifics, but yeah.
Hi, my name is Anna Joy, and as someone who is an LGBT student on campus and who would like to see this conversation continue past the bounds of the CU Center, and today, what are ways in which LGBT students on campus and other activists within that realm, and maybe people who are on the opposing side can create a conversation of reconciliation on this issue to diminish accusations of discrimination from either side of the equation?
I love that question. Thank you. Did you want to start, or did you?
Sure. I mean, either way.
You know what I'm going to say. I
Yep.
know what you're going to say. So we got a very similar question yesterday, and it's a really good question. So, okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. One of the things I often say, because as a college professor as well, the student groups will sometimes come to me, the college Republicans, college Democrats, and so on, and say, we want to have better dialogue, so should we have a debate? Should we have a panel? And I say, you should have pizza. Meaning that it doesn't always have to be about getting together to talk through and hash out our differences. It's sometimes just about coming together and building relationship and getting to know one another, remembering that the political stuff is a means toward us having flourishing lives, and sometimes it's nice to just have flourishing lives and do things we enjoy, like having pizza together. If you're anti-pizza, you're a moral monster. I want nothing to do with you. But if you're pro-pizza, let's talk. So, or, and I've seen this happen. On my own campus, the LGBT student group and one of the more conservative Christian groups got together and did a toy drive around the holidays. Who could be against giving toys to children, right? So it's that kind of thing, and it goes to the point that I made at the opening of my remarks about this happening in relationship, and sometimes it's good to just focus on the relationships and getting to know each other.
So what I would add to that, and I agree with everything that John just said, and actually, getting to know John and his partner has been helpful for me and Sharif in putting faces to theories, right? Because before our current book about debating religious liberty and discrimination, we spent 5 years debating same-sex marriage. We weren't his co-author in the book by that title, but Sharif and I had done work on how to think about marriage. John had criticized our work, but in a spirit of friendship, right? I mean, the criticism of the work was to get at the truth. And that's hopefully what's happening tonight, right? John and I are disagreeing with each other. Hopefully we're not being disagreeable about it, but we are disagreeing, and we both want to get a better understanding of the truth. So what I wanted to add, though, is that I also think it's important that we each are willing to try to model for let's say, our own side of these debates, how we ought to speak and behave. So I actually think it's vitally important that John doesn't call me and Sharif bigots, and we don't call him and his partner perverts, right? Because there can be name calling in both directions, and that would kill a project like this. If John publicly referred, I don't know what he says about us behind our back. Maybe he does, but at least publicly, he doesn't attack our integrity or our goodwill. We tried, not to publicly attack his integrity or his goodwill, and that's important. And then the third thing I'll say is that It's important to think about, so if you're on this campus and you have disagreements about how to understand the order of creation of male and female and sexual orientation and gender identity, to think those things through together in good will, in good faith, and to say, look, we disagree about how to understand what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God, to be created male and female. But let's talk about it. What are the competing interpretations of the book of Genesis or the Gospel of Matthew, if you're looking at it from a biblical perspective? What are the competing philosophical perspectives on how to think about marriage and human anthropology and embodiment? And then I think both sides will see that there's a lot more going on here. Right? It's not just one side's being heretical and rejecting the authority of Scripture, or the other side is just being bigoted and hating gay people. Both sides have good points to make. And so there also needs to be space to have those sorts of conversations over pizza and I would say beer. Lutheran beer, perhaps.
Okay. Ryan also said one other thing last night that I think is worth repeating, which is to really, speaking of pizza and beer, but to cultivate your social media diet, because so many of these exchanges when they happen on Twitter or on Facebook or in this sort of soundbite thing that sort of quickly escalates and is not often the best forum to have that kind of dialogue, and I thought that was a very good point.
To preface, I just want to thank both of you for your appearance. The book truly was an accomplishment in concision, eloquence, civility, so thank you for being here. I'm going to direct my question at Dr. Corvino, but I'd appreciate both your perspectives. My question concerns the idea of dignitary harms and the evolving jurisprudence surrounding the ongoing culture wars, which have kind of been a broad subject, and the definition of discrimination at large. So to get down to it, how does the idea of dignitary harms play into the Masterpiece Cake case, if it does, and is the concept of dignitary harms in the debate agreed upon enough to help better formulate a better understanding of how to define discrimination?
Excellent question. And to answer the second part of your question first, no, I think we don't have enough agreement on the notion of dignitary harm. And I actually think that one of the kind of unfinished projects of the book, one of the things that I wish I had gotten clearer on and that I think that we as a community and conversation need to get clearer on, is the notion of dignitary harm. Because it's often cashed out, people think it just means sort of hurt feelings, and I don't think that's what it means. It has something to do with exclusion in the context of a more systematic exclusion. And just to say a little bit more for those of you who haven't read the book or maybe haven't heard the notion of dignitary harm, when we look at cases of discrimination, one way to think about them is by separating what we might call material harms from dignitary harms. So material harms being actually deprived of goods and services that you need. In these cake cases, of course, the material harm is negligible if it exists at all, right? So it's first, no one's going to starve because they don't have a wedding cake. You know, this is not like we were talking about, not selling bread and milk and eggs to people. And if the couple has to go to another store, that may be an inconvenience. It may be a real cost in time. There's a case I talk about in the book where a woman and her friend spent hours. They were trying on wedding dresses in a dress shop in New Jersey, and big sort of thing. You get together with your friends, and after they finally picked out the wedding dress, she went to order the wedding dress. The owner found out that it was for a lesbian wedding. Said, "I'm not going to sell you this wedding dress." I mean, so that there is a material cost there of time and wasted energy and so on. But really, in the kinds of cases we're talking about, dignitary harm is the more relevant part. And that's true in a number of the cases of racial discrimination that we've discussed. Bob Jones University, a Christian school which did not allow interracial dating. This was Bob Jones, a spokesperson for the university, explained, "God has separated people for his own purposes. He has erected barriers between the nations, not only land and sea barriers, but also ethnic, cultural, and language barriers. God has made people different from one another and intends for those differences to remain. Bob Jones University is opposed to the intermarriage of the races because it breaks down the barriers God has established." And when do you think that that quotation is from? 1950s, 1960s? It's actually from 1998. They did not get rid of that policy until the year 2000. Now, what was bad about that policy? It wasn't that, oh my God, where are people going to get a Christian education in 1998? Because they could come to a great place like Concordia, right? So it wasn't the material harm of it. There was something about the way this both reflected and reinforced a kind of systematic exclusion on the basis of racial identity. And it's interesting to note that in that case, Bob Jones University had admitted black students as early as the 1970s, and they did so without being forced by the court to do so. They did so freely. It wasn't that they didn't want to interact with black people at all. They just didn't believe in interracial marriage. So there's a case of a dignitary harm rather than a material harm, but one that is still, I think, worth doing something about. And what was done about it was that we said, okay, if you want to keep doing that and violating the rules about discrimination, the federal rules about discrimination, you're going to lose your tax-exempt status. And the university would rather spend like $1 million, I think it was, than in paying in back taxes than to get rid of that policy. They didn't do so until, like I said, the year 2000.
Yeah, so I think it's important that, it is important that we look at the dignitary harms, because dignitary harms are real, and you especially see this in the race context, as John just mentioned. But I also think there's an important distinction into how we therefore apply it in the case of something like Jack Phillips, the baker's case, or the pro-life medicine case. Because if you think about what was undergirding our intuitions about the racism cases, is that we know that in the focal case of racism, it's a form of white supremacy. Right? It's people saying that white people are better than other races. And therefore, the opposition to interracial marriage, it wasn't based on like deep philosophical and theological reflections. Despite what the Bob Jones spokesperson said, I have no doubt, the sincerity of this person. Right? They might have actually believed and been sincere about it, but they were sincerely misguided. That when you actually look at the scriptures, when you look at the history of the theology of marriage, Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, even the Enlightenment philosophers, Locke, Kant, Eastern thinkers like Gandhi, they all thought marriage was a colorblind institution, that marriage united a man and a woman regardless of their race, because a man and a woman of any racial composition can unite as one flesh, and that one flesh union can create new life, and then unite new life with both a mother and a father. And so when you were opposed to interracial marriage, when do you think those bans first popped up in world history? They pop up in the US colonies, and they pop up precisely in conjunction and connection with African slavery. So here you take something that had been a common law liberty. Interracial marriage was a common law liberty. Blacks and whites and all sorts of other races, people had been getting married across racial divides throughout human history. And then the US colonies say no. Why do they say no? Because they're enslaving a group of people based on the color of their skin. If you allow interracial marriage, you'll have interracial children. If you have interracial children, your system of race-based slavery will come undone. It'll be shown for the unjust sham that it is. So as a result, when we hear about cases of racism, and what then developed from that was a system of white supremacy, a system of racial subjugation. Which is why you couldn't say, when the bans on interracial marriage were struck down, what was said when the bans on same-sex marriage were struck down, that these beliefs are based on decent and honorable premises that are held by people of goodwill and good reason here and throughout the world. The Supreme Court didn't say that about opposition to interracial marriage. It did say it about opposition to same-sex marriage. And as a result, I think when we get to the Jack Phillips case, we're much more like that Supreme Court case from '93 about pro-life medicine. Whatever one thinks of abortion, it can't be denied that there are common and respectable reasons for opposing it other than hatred of or condescension towards women. Right? The hatred of and condescension towards women is dignitary harm. And so that same sentence, whatever one thinks of same-sex marriage, it can not be denied that there are common and respectable reasons for opposing it other than hatred of or condescension towards gays and lesbians. I think that second sentence, which I just read, follows, and that's how we can distinguish a case like Phillips from a case involving the Keith Bardwell bakery. I know John and I disagree about that, though, and so the question for you is to think through, on what side of the line do you want to place Jack Phillips? Is he more like the person opposed to interracial marriage, or is he more like that 93 Supreme Court case involving pro-life medicine? Is he inflicting a dignitary harm, or do we just have a disagreement about what marriage is?
You know, I think it's important to note something about the history here. I believe it was 2011 or 2012 where for the first time in Gallup polling, a majority of Americans favored same-sex marriage. It wasn't until sometime in the 90s that a majority of Americans supported interracial marriage, some 20 or 30 years after Loving versus Virginia, the 1967 decision that struck down laws against interracial marriage. During that intervening period of several decades, would we say that none of the people for whom interracial marriage was a bridge too far were decent, honorable people who just, had a different view about marriage? Look, I think it's really easy sometimes. I'm not saying that Ryan is doing this tonight, but I think there's a real danger of it, so I want to point it out. I think it's really easy sometimes to sort of contrast the ugliest forms of racism with the nice, friendly people like Barronelle Stutzman, the florist, and Jack Phillips, the baker, who just, look, I love gay people, but I just can't do the services for your wedding. Except that not all racism involves like carrying torches in Charlottesville, and not all opposition to same-sex relationships involves nice grandmotherly types like Barronelle Stutzman. And if you don't believe me, look at the comments on my YouTube page and see that some of this is. So I think that both the histories of racism and the histories of discrimination against same-sex relationships and gay people are complicated. And the fact that the discrimination against same-sex couples, same-sex relationships, gay people, has a longer history with a lot more sort of religious underpinning doesn't make it better from my perspective. It actually makes it harder and worse to confront in some ways. So it's complicated.
So I just want to clarify something, because I acknowledge that in the case of the spokesperson for Bob Jones University that she might have been sincere. But what I said was she was sincerely misguided.
Yeah.
I distinguish between the people holding the view and the viewpoint itself. And that's what the Supreme Court has done. The Supreme Court said that opposition to same-sex marriage was based on decent and honorable philosophical and theological premises. They're not talking about the people, they're talking about the viewpoint. Likewise, in the abortion context, it says, what everyone thinks about abortion, it can't be denied that there are common and respectable reasons for opposing abortion other than hatred of women. That's what I'm getting at here. You can't say that there are decent and honorable, common and respectable reasons for opposing interracial marriage. The reasons just aren't there. Try to think of a decent and honorable reason for being against interracial marriage. I think the reasons are there when it comes to pro-life medicine and when it comes to support for husband-wife marriage. And so it's the viewpoint itself that is different. But then the second thing is, think about what John said. It took 30 years after the law changed to recognize interracial marriage for public opinion to change. And so you needed the force of law banning racial discrimination to actually change the way people think about racial equality. But John pointed out the opposite is true in this context. The majority of people supported what he would call marriage equality before the law recognized marriage equality. And so it strikes me as less of a compelling state interest to punish the wicked if there's one baker in the entire state of Colorado who can't do the same-sex wedding cake. The situations are actually different in terms of sword and shield, in terms of majority viewpoint and minority right to dissent.
I would just add that the whole notion of who's in the majority and who's in the minority is not just something that varies over time, but also varies from location to location.
Yep.
One of the reasons that most of these cases involve places where you say, well, there are plenty of other bakers in the neighborhood willing to do this, is because There is not a federal law prohibiting sexual orientation discrimination in public accommodations. And so the places that tend to have those laws, the states, the local jurisdictions, tend to be progressive places. They're not places like Mississippi, where I suspect that finding the relevant providers might be a bit harder. Thank you.
Thank you both for coming out as well. My question also relates to dignitary harm and is mostly directed for Dr. Corvino. So you state that you believe that dignitary harm should be protected against legally. My question was, how would you reconcile a situation where both parties claim to have been harmed under dignitary harm?
Well, this is why I think we need a deeper, richer theory of dignitary harm, and I acknowledge that this is one of the unfinished projects of the book. Because I don't think that when we're talking about dignitary harm, we're just talking about hurt feelings. We're talking about systematic exclusion. I do think that there is a context of systematic exclusion for same-sex couples, not just with respect to exclusion from marriage, but also, and I think people forget about this, where you've got the people who are now talking about liberty, 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 actually favoring things like anti-sodomy laws, which made consenting sexual relationships criminal, which made me an unapprehended felon in the state of Texas for many years. And these same people, who supported sodomy laws, I'm not saying Ryan supported sodomy laws, but many of the same people who supported sodomy laws, who opposed same-sex marriage, now say, oh, we're the oppressed ones, right? And we are the ones who are excluded from the public square. I think it's really important to recognize that laws like Colorado's public accommodations laws protect both ways. They mean that Jack Phillips can't refuse to sell the cake to the same-sex couple. They mean that Marjorie Silva or I can't refuse to sell a cake to Ryan and Anna and say, no, I don't want you people getting married because you're going to have more Catholic children and they're going to grow up to have your views and I don't want, so no, right? Because that would be discrimination. So they protect in both directions. But yeah, I grant that the dignitary harm thing is complicated, and it's partly complicated because you have to figure out a way to protect people from that while also protecting robust free speech considerations, and that makes it harder.
But so here's where I think that this, the application of the laws isn't being applied in an even-handed way, or at least not so much the application of the laws, but who chooses to file lawsuits, whether it's individual plaintiffs or state attorney general. The Human Rights Campaign will not hire me. Planned Parenthood will not hire me. And the reason why is because I'm a pro-traditional marriage, pro-life Catholic. Are they discriminating on the basis of religion? Because in employment law, it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of religion. And my pro-life viewpoint follows straight from my Catholic identity. We even have a document called Evangelium Vitae. It's a papal encyclical that John Paul II wrote. It's in Latin, so I don't expect any of you to know what it means. The translation is the gospel of life. And so we think that the gospel is the gospel of life. And so all of our pro-life beliefs and actions spring from our Catholic identity. So when Planned Parenthood refuses to hire me, are they discriminating based on my identity, or are they hiring based upon their mission? I think they're hiring based on their mission. So I also think it's the case that when a Catholic school won't employ a gay man who's in a gay sexual relationship, they're not discriminating against him based on his identity. They're hiring based on their mission. And yet no one sues Planned Parenthood for not hiring pro-life Catholics, and Catholic schools get sued several times a year for not hiring gay men who are in gay sexual relationships. And so there's a double standard here. Because the way that we use the law that says no discrimination on the basis of religion is as a shield to protect people from unjust discrimination, not as a sword to impose a certain orthodoxy on other people. I'm not going to impose my religious orthodoxy on Planned Parenthood. But Tim Gill wants to impose a certain sexual orthodoxy on Jack Phillips. Jack Phillips is now is at risk of being inflicted with a dignitary harm, not from a private citizen, right? So you could say that Jack Phillips inflicted a dignitary harm on the same-sex couple. But now the state government is inflicting a dignitary harm on him, saying that his beliefs are so contrary to justice and the common good that he can't have freedom to live his life and run his business in accordance with his beliefs. That stigmatizes him, that demonizes him, that limits both his professional opportunities and material opportunities, but it also hurts his sense of dignity. So there's dignitary harms on both sides. And I hope the court takes that into consideration. I think Kennedy is sensitive to this.
So you'll be unsurprised to learn that I disagree with much of what Ryan just said in his application of the notion of dignitary harm, but that may be partly because we need to get a clearer sense of what dignitary harm means and how it doesn't just mean, we disagree with you. But I want to go back to what you said about, HRC won't hire you, Planned Parenthood. Well, newsflash, Heritage is not going to hire me. Focus on the Family is not going to hire me, right? So, and I get that there are organizations aimed at promoting a particular message that hire in accordance with that message. It gets more complicated, I think, when we talk about schools, and I'm generally inclined to give wide latitude to religious schools on religious matters, but when we talk about people, you're hiring a French teacher, hiring an English teacher, and so on, it gets more complicated, and I'm not going to do justice to those complications here, so I just want to bracket that and note that it gets more complicated. But I don't think the Masterpiece Cake Shop is that complicated because it involves telling the couple that they can't buy the very same items that other people who walk into the store buy. That's the problem. And that's different. And it's not the case that Marjorie Silva is telling William Jack or you that you can't buy the very same items that other people who walk into the store buy.
But you're overlooking that the very same item in different contexts carries different messages. And what Jack Phillips' objection to is to expressing a message that he disagrees with. So imagine that one of the, let's say he's a catalog baker, and you go in and you say, I want cake on page 7, and the cake on page 7 says, God blesses this relationship. And they're like, look, last week you baked that very same cake for Ryan and Anna. This week I want you to bake it for Ryan and John. It's the very same cake, but in context, it communicates two very different messages. And that's what Jack Phillips' objection is to. And I think we need to be sensitive to this, that it's a message-based objection. And message is going to be determined by the design and the event and the context.
So you'll be surprised to learn that I actually am inclined to agree with Ryan that in a cake that said, God blesses this union, because of the writing and because I believe of the line, you have to do the line drawing somehow, that somebody who wants to sell it to one group but not another group, because if it says this union and this is an indexical that refers to something very specific, that there is a reason for a free speech exemption in that case. But I don't think that therefore you can make the argument that any time you have an item that's going to express a different message in a different context, the baker can just refuse to sell it in the one case or the other, because I go back to Bardwell Bakery. Selling the wedding cake to the interracial couple, is it going to express a different message than selling the wedding cake to the same race couple? It's going to say, I recognize and celebrate this marriage versus I recognize and celebrate this marriage. And yet it strikes me as a clear case of racial discrimination to say I'm going to sell this very cake to one couple but not to the other. That's the worry that I have.
But John, you seem to be contradicting yourself. Because you said if it had words that says, God blesses this union,
right,
then the baker wouldn't have to do it. And so
right,
presumably, the Bardwell Bakery wouldn't have to bake that cake for an interracial couple if you're
right,
going to be consistent.
True.
So if you're willing to say that once we agree that the cake is communicating a message, you don't have to bake it for messages that you disagree with, and that would include Keith Bardwell not doing it. Then all we're disagreeing about is whether or not a wedding cake without words conveys a message. And so the Keith Bardwell example is just a distraction. What we need to focus on is a wedding cake communicative? Is it expressive? And I think the answer to that is this, I want to say obviously, but I don't want to say obviously because we disagree, and I don't want to say you're obviously wrong, right? But I think it's almost obviously the case that the cake communicates something, which is how when you walk into a room, let's say there was a table here and there was a cake on it, you could tell if it was a birthday cake or a wedding cake just by looking at it. Does it have balloons and flowers and candles, or is it three-tiered with the little designy things that they do on wedding cakes? You know what I'm talking about. And then you know what it means is a wedding has taken place. It should be celebrated, hurrah. Right? There's a message there, even without the words. And that's what Jack Phillips says he can't do.
Yeah, so I think that our disagreement here is actually deep and nuanced. And part of it is a disagreement about how to draw this line, about what message is being communicated when. And my own view is that legal line drawing is complicated, and sometimes you just got to draw a line recognizing that there are these borderline cases. And I agree that when you start talking about a cake that actually says God blesses this union, you're very close to the line on one side or the other. The difference is, I think, that if you just have a wedding cake, what does it express? I mean, it expresses that this is a wedding, but it's not much more articulate than that. It doesn't mean that the baker blesses the union. It doesn't necessarily mean that God blesses the union. It means that there's a wedding happening. When there's a declarative sentence on the cake, I think it's more articulate. So that's why I'm inclined to say that if there's actual writing on the cake, that makes a difference. But look, the worry here is that once you take this line about messages, what do you do with a cake that says happy birthday on it? What if I think your ongoing life is not worth living? And I don't want to express that message. Now, and suppose I think that because I don't believe Catholic lives are worth living, or I don't believe, it seems to me that would run afoul of anti-discrimination law. And even though I grant that the birthday cake is expressive in some sense, I don't think it's expressive enough to override the relevant anti-discrimination law.
All right, this is the last thing I'm going to say because you've been patiently waiting, and you can come back, and then I just won't say a response because at some point we have to stop. But
we do have to stop.
I just think in the case of the birthday cake, that's clearly an identity-based objection. I'm against your continued existence. And so there is a limiting principle here. If you won't bake me a birthday cake because you're against my continued existence, you're objecting based on my identity. But if I won't do a wedding cake because I don't think this is a wedding, because I think weddings require brides and grooms, it's not based upon who you are, right? He wouldn't bake this cake regardless of who the identity of the person requesting it. Had it been the heterosexual mother of the groom that came in, same objection.
Yeah, so I agree with you that the birthday cake is worse. Let's agree on that. Okay.
Thank you all so much for coming and having such a respectful debate. That's really awesome to see. My question is directed towards Dr. Anderson, though. Do you think that Alliance Defending Freedom's defense of their client is too narrow when made solely on the basis of artistic expression?
Gotcha, yeah. I think that ADF argued this case the way they did because of existing Supreme Court precedent. And so existing Supreme Court precedent is much more robust on freedom of speech than it is on free exercise of religion. There's a very, very long line of cases that say you can't be compelled to speak a message with which you disagree. And so they argued their case in that line of cases simply because the legal facts and the relevant precedents are better. There are other arguments that were made that they included in their brief, but they were subsidiary arguments that people who filed amicus briefs made. But I think the decision they made is eminently defensible, which is that, who was it? Don Rumsfeld said, you go to war with the army you have. You litigate cases with the laws that you have. And so even though, as a purely philosophical matter, we might think that there's a different set of arguments that best captures what the objection is, given U.S. law, this is how they had to litigate it in a courtroom.
Thank you so much.
Great job.
Thank you. Yes, you have
lived up to our hopes and exceeded them. This was a tremendous debate, a tremendous display of civil discourse, and also getting really into the issues and fleshing them out. You've given us much food for thought and for discussion. We, Concordia University Irvine, are thankful to you all for being here, students, for coming and learning, and for those outside of campus who aren't part of the Concordia community. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it, and we hope you've gotten a lot out of this.